There's a secret hiding in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of your interior experience, and it whispers a truth that dismantles everything you've been taught about the sovereignty of your mind. You believe your thoughts are yours, that the internal monologue narrating your existence springs from some authentic wellspring deep within you, that the beliefs you hold are the product of your own careful reasoning, that the desires moving through you originate in the core of your being. But what if I told you that this sense of psychological ownership is itself a thought, and that thought, like all the others, didn't originate with you at all? Terence McKenna understood something that most people spend their entire lives overlooking. You are not the author of your thoughts. You are their receiver, their temporary host, their broadcast station. Your mind is not a fountain generating original content, but rather an antenna tuned to frequencies that have been transmitted for thousands of years, propagating themselves through human consciousness, like self-replicating patterns moving through a living medium. You are, in the most literal sense, a node in a vast network of collective intelligence, processing and retransmitting information that existed long before you were born, and will continue long after your body returns to the earth. This isn't mysticism dressed up as philosophy. This is the recognition of something McKenna called the mimetic nature of thought, the understanding that ideas behave like organisms, that they possess a kind of life independent of the minds that host them, that they reproduce, mutate, compete for survival, and evolve across the landscape of human culture. Your thoughts are not possessions. They are visitors, parasites, symbiotes, colonizers. They are viral in nature, infectious, contagious. They leap from mind to mind through language, through image, through story and symbol, and they use you as a vehicle for their continuation. You think you're thinking, but really, you're being thought through. Consider for a moment the last opinion you held with absolute certainty. Trace it backward. Where did it come from? Did it spring fully formed from your own contemplation, or did you absorb it from somewhere else? From a teacher, a book, a conversation, a film, a cultural atmosphere so pervasive you never noticed you were breathing it in? And that teacher, where did they get it? And the person before them? Follow the chain back far enough, and you'll find that most of what you consider your thoughts are actually ancient patterns, cultural programs, linguistic structures that have been running on human wetware for centuries, adapting and evolving, but fundamentally unchanged in their core architecture. McKenna saw this clearly, particularly through his explorations of altered states of consciousness. In the psychedelic experience, one of the first things that becomes apparent is the constructed nature of ordinary thought. The internal dialogue that seems so natural, so essentially you in everyday life, is revealed to be a kind of looping program, a recursive pattern that maintains itself through constant repetition. It's like static on a radio, interference generated by the receiver itself, and you've mistaken this static for the signal. The psychedelic state doesn't necessarily give you better thoughts. It interrupts the usual broadcasting, creates gaps in the transmission, and in those gaps, you can suddenly perceive the difference between consciousness itself and the content consciousness is processing. What you call thinking is mostly remembering and recombining. You're running scripts inherited from your parents, your culture, your species. The voice in your head that you identify as yourself is actually a chorus, a parliament of inherited perspectives, each one a ghost of someone else's thinking, reanimated in your neural tissue. The words themselves, the very medium of thought for most people, are not yours. You didn't invent language. You were inserted into it, shaped by it, and now it shapes everything you perceive. Language is the original meme, the first and most successful mind virus, and it has colonized human consciousness so completely that most people can't imagine existence without it. This is where McKenna's insight becomes truly radical. If your thoughts are not your own, then what are you? If the content of consciousness is borrowed, transmitted, inherited, then where is the authentic self? The ego, that sense of being a separate, autonomous entity with private thoughts and personal opinions, is itself a meme, perhaps the most successful one ever propagated. The ego is a story the brain tells itself, a narrative construction held together by memory and language. And this story has convinced you that you are its author, when in fact you are merely its current chapter. The culture you were born into, whether you call it Western civilization, modernity, industrial society, the spectacle, or simply consensus reality, operates as a vast mimetic machine, reproducing itself through your thinking. It programs you from birth with its categories, its values, its ways of passing experience. It teaches you what to pay attention to and what to ignore. It trains you in the proper way to think, the acceptable range of opinions, the respectable boundaries of inquiry. And it does this so subtly, so pervasively, that you mistake its voice for your own. You think you chose your politics. They were installed in you by 1,000 subtle influences, reinforced through identification with tribal markers, maintained through the emotional charge of belonging. You think you formed your aesthetic preferences through individual taste. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear, the space through which they move, and this awareness is vaster and stranger than any thought that could arise within it. The revelation that your thoughts are not your own is not a diminishment, but an expansion. It means you are not limited to the contents of your conditioned mind. It means the boundaries of your identity are permeable, provisional, open to renegotiation. It means you are participating in something much larger than yourself, a collective intelligence, a species-wide process of meaning-making that has been unfolding for tens of thousands of years. You are a momentary crystallization of this process, a temporary form through which the universe contemplates itself. But here's where it gets interesting, where McKenna's vision becomes not just analytical, but transformative. If thoughts are mimetic, if they behave like organisms competing for survival in the ecosystem of human attention, then not all thoughts are created equal. Some memes are parasitic, depleting the host's vitality to serve their own replication. Some are symbiotic, enhancing the host's capacity while ensuring their own continuation. Some are mutualistic, creating emergent properties that transcend both the thought and the thinker. And some are revolutionary, capable of transforming the entire mimetic landscape, creating new possibilities for consciousness itself. The dominant culture, the mainstream mimetic environment, tends toward the parasitic. It reproduces thoughts that maintain the status quo, that keep you productive, compliant, anxious enough to consume, but not so anxious that you stop functioning. And most radically, it was to seek out the truly other, forms of intelligence, modes of consciousness, dimensions of experience that exist outside the standard human mimetic repertoire. This is where his advocacy for psychedelic experience becomes crucial. The psychedelic state, particularly at high doses, doesn't just rearrange familiar thoughts or provide new perspectives on old problems. It introduces genuinely alien information into consciousness, transmissions from outside the normal human channel. McKenna believed these experiences revealed that consciousness is not contained within the skull, but is something we participate in, something we tune into, and that there are many stations on this dial that human culture has forgotten or suppressed. The psychedelic experience demonstrates that the thoughts running through your mind in ordinary consciousness are just one narrow bandwidth, one cultural radio station, and there are infinite others. What makes this relevant beyond just the psychedelic context is the recognition that your mind is always being influenced by forces you don't consciously control. The question is not whether you will be programmed, that's inevitable given the social nature of human existence, but rather who or what will do the programming. Will it be the culture's default settings, installed through 1,000 acts of unconscious absorption? Will it be the advertising industry, explicitly designed to hack your psychology for profit? Will it be political ideologies, each claiming to have the complete picture of reality? Or will you take some measure of responsibility for curating your own mental environment, for deliberately exposing yourself to ideas and experiences that challenge your inherited patterns? Consider how much of your daily thought is actually just repetition, the same loops playing over and over. The worries about work, the rehearsed arguments with people who aren't present, the familiar narratives about who you are and what your life means, the same judgments and comparisons, the standard anxieties and desires. These are grooves worn deep in the neural substrate, pathways of least resistance that your brain defaults to because they've been reinforced through countless repetitions. And where did these patterns come from? Most of them were established before you were old enough to question them, installed by your family, your schooling, your culture, your trauma, your media environment. The recognition that thoughts are mimetic, that they propagate through human populations like viruses, helps explain why certain ideas seem to be in the air at particular moments in history. Why do certain concerns suddenly occupy everyone's attention? Why do new moral frameworks emerge and spread with startling speed? Why do fashion, art, music, and language all seem to move in waves, with innovation at the edges gradually spreading to the center before being replaced by the next wave? It's because ideas are not static things that individuals possess, but rather dynamic patterns that move through the network of human consciousness, mutating and evolving as they go. McKenna pointed out that this process accelerates in periods of cultural crisis and transformation. When the old patterns start to break down, when the established mimetic environment becomes unstable, consciousness becomes more fluid, more open to novelty. The rigid thought forms that maintained consensus reality begin to crack, and through those cracks, new possibilities emerge. This is happening now, in our current historical moment, as the meta-narratives that held industrial civilization together lose their coherence, as the center fails to hold, as the entire global mimetic environment undergoes unprecedented stress. You can feel it in the quality of public discourse, which has become increasingly fragmented, increasingly incoherent. The shared reality that once held most people in the same basic perceptual framework is dissolving. People are no longer just disagreeing about politics or values. They're inhabiting entirely different reality tunnels, different sets of basic facts, different ontological frameworks. This is mimetic chaos, the breakdown of the old order, and while it's disorienting and sometimes terrifying, it's also creating an opening for radically new forms of consciousness to emerge. But here's the danger. In this mimetic chaos, you become more vulnerable to predatory thought forms, to ideas specifically designed to exploit confusion and anxiety. Conspiracy theories, for instance, are parasitic memes that offer the comfort of explanation in exchange for demanding your complete loyalty. They provide a simple story that makes sense of complexity, but they also lock you into a rigid interpretive framework that becomes harder and harder to escape. Fundamentalisms of all kinds, religious, political, ideological, operate similarly. They offer certainty in exchange for submission, a clear identity in exchange for the surrender of independent thought. The sophisticated approach, the approach McKenna advocated, is to hold your thoughts lightly, to treat all beliefs as provisional, to maintain a stance of informed skepticism even toward your own convictions. This doesn't mean believing nothing or falling into relativism. It means understanding that every thought, every belief, every framework is a tool, useful in certain contexts, limiting in others. It means recognizing that you are not the fixed identity your thoughts seem to construct, but rather the fluid awareness that can adopt different perspectives, try on different thought forms, and discard them when they no longer serve. This capacity for cognitive flexibility, for switching between different mimetic environments without being captured by any of them, is increasingly crucial for navigating the current historical moment. The people who insist on defending a single rigid worldview are fighting a losing battle against complexity. Reality is too weird, too multifaceted, too rapidly changing to be captured by any one system of thought. What's needed is a kind of intellectual nomadism, an ability to move between different conceptual territories, to speak multiple philosophical languages, to hold multiple models simultaneously without needing them to collapse into a single unified theory. McKenna was a master of this. He could speak the language of shamanism and ethnobotany, of depth psychology and quantum mechanics, of Celtic mythology and computational theory, weaving them together not to create some ultimate synthesis, but to demonstrate the plasticity of consciousness itself. He showed that you could entertain the most far-out metaphysical speculations without losing your grounding, that you could take seriously both the material scientific worldview and the most outlandish psychedelic revelations, that contradiction and paradox are features of reality rather than problems to be solved. What he was modeling was a post-mimetic consciousness, an awareness that has seen through the game of identification with thought. This doesn't mean transcending thought. That's probably impossible and certainly not necessary. It means changing your relationship to thought, recognizing it as a tool rather than as your identity, as a process you participate in rather than as something you possess. It means understanding that you are not the contents of your mind any more than a television is the shows it displays. This shift in perspective has profound implications. If you're not your thoughts, then the loss of a belief is not the loss of yourself. If you're not your thoughts, then disagreement is not an attack on your being. If you're not your thoughts, then you can change your mind without experiencing it as a fundamental threat. The ego defends its thoughts so viciously precisely because it's constructed out of thoughts, and any challenge to a core belief feels like a challenge to existence itself. But if you've recognized the ego as just another meme, a particularly sticky one, but a meme nonetheless, then you can afford to be much more playful, much more experimental with your thinking. This brings us to a deeper layer of McKenna's insight, the recognition that language itself is the primary mechanism through which memes propagate, the substrate in which human thought takes shape. You don't think in pure consciousness and then translate those thoughts into words. The words are the thought. Language structures consciousness in such fundamental ways that most people can't imagine thinking without it. And language is collective by definition. You can't have a private language that no one else speaks, because language only exists in the shared space between minds, in the agreement about what sounds or symbols correspond to what meanings. Every language carries within it a worldview, a way of carving up reality, a set of implicit assumptions about what exists and how it relates. The structure of your native language shapes how you perceive time, causality, self, and world in ways you probably never consciously noticed. Languages that have different tense systems create different relationships to past and future. Languages that don't distinguish between he and she create different gender dynamics. Languages that place the verb at different positions in the sentence create different narrative flows, different ways of revealing information, different patterns of attention. McKenna was fascinated by how psychedelics, particularly DMT and psilocybin, seem to bypass language or create an experience that language can't adequately capture. In the deep psychedelic state, you encounter something that feels profoundly meaningful, pregnant with significance. But when you try to bring it back into linguistic form, it slips away, leaving you with metaphors and approximations that never quite capture the thing itself. This suggested to him that there are forms of meaning, dimensions of intelligence, that exist outside the linguistic matrix, that language is a filter rather than a mirror of consciousness. This is a crucial point because it means that the mimetic colonization of your mind is not complete or inevitable. There are experiences, states of consciousness, forms of knowing that exist beyond the reach of words, beyond the reach of culture's programming. The ineffable is not just a mystical abstraction, it's the recognition that consciousness is more fundamental than its contents, that awareness itself cannot be captured by any thought, word, or concept, because it's the space in which all thoughts, words, and concepts appear. But here's the paradox. To communicate this insight, McKenna had to use language, had to deploy words and concepts and stories. He had to use memes to point beyond the mimetic, had to infect people with ideas that might help them recognize they're infected with ideas. This is the fundamental challenge of any teaching about consciousness. You can't think your way out of thinking, can't use the conditioned mind to transcend conditioning, can't deploy language to escape language. What you can do is use these tools in ways that create gaps, openings, moments of recognition where the nature of the tool itself becomes visible. This is why McKenna was such a powerful storyteller, such an engaging speaker. He wasn't trying to convince you of a system of beliefs or convert you to a doctrine. He was using language as a kind of incantation, a spell designed to alter consciousness through rhythm and metaphor and associative leaps. He was infecting you with a particular kind of meme, a meme about memes, a thought that makes you aware of the nature of thought. These meta-memes, these self-referential ideas that point to the process of thinking itself, are like viruses that hack the operating system, that introduce a bug into the program that allows you to see the code running beneath the interface. The idea that your thoughts are not your own is one of these meta-memes. Once it takes root, it begins to transform your relationship to all your other thoughts. You start to catch yourself, to notice when you're repeating a familiar pattern, to recognize when you're channeling someone else's voice. You develop an observer function, a part of awareness that can watch the thinking process without being completely absorbed in it. This observer is not separate from thought. It arises within the same field of consciousness, but it introduces a degree of freedom, a gap between stimulus and response, between the arising of a thought and the identification with it. This observing awareness is what meditation traditions have been cultivating for thousands of years through different techniques, watching the breath, noting sensations, observing thoughts as they arise and pass. But McKenna was pointing to something that goes beyond mere observation. He was suggesting that consciousness can become actively creative in its relationship to thought, that once you've seen through the illusion of ownership, you can begin to play with the mimetic environment, to consciously participate in the evolution of ideas rather than being passively determined by them. This is where his notion of the human imagination becomes central. The imagination is not just the ability to picture things that don't exist. It's the capacity for consciousness to transcend its own current state, to conceive of possibilities beyond what culture has defined as real. Imagination is the evolutionary edge of consciousness, the place where novelty enters the system, where genuinely new patterns can emerge rather than just recombinations of the old. And imagination requires a certain freedom from the tyranny of inherited thought, a certain looseness in your relationship to the mimetic environment. Culture, McKenna argued, functions largely to constrain imagination, to keep it within acceptable channels. The socialization process is essentially a narrowing of possibility, a training in what's real and what's fantasy, what's serious and what's frivolous, what's possible and what's impossible. By the time you're an adult, you've internalized so many constraints on your imagination that you can't even perceive most of reality's actual weirdness. You've been taught to edit your experience, to ignore or explain away anything that doesn't fit the cultural story about how things work. This is why children are so much more open to anomalous experience, why they see fairies and ghosts, and have imaginary friends that seem completely real to them. It's not that children are more gullible or less rational, it's that they haven't yet been fully programmed with the cultural reality tunnel, haven't yet had their native capacity for experiencing the strange and the other systematically trained out of them. The process of growing up is largely a process of forgetting, of narrowing, of learning to see less rather than more. What psychedelics do, in McKenna's view, is temporarily disrupt this trained incapacity, this cultural blinding. They don't show you illusions or hallucinations in the ordinary sense. They reveal that what you call normal perception is itself a kind of hallucination, a culturally constructed narrative that your brain projects onto the raw data of experience. In the psychedelic state, the brain's filtering mechanisms are disrupted, and suddenly you're experiencing more of what's actually there, more of reality's inherent strangeness, more of the vast weird universe that culture has trained you not to notice. This is not to say that everything experienced in a psychedelic state is objectively real in some simple sense. The question of what's real becomes much more complex when you recognize that all perception is constructed, that all experience is mediated by the nervous system and the conceptual frameworks we bring to it. The point is that the culturally sanctioned version of reality, the consensus hallucination that we agree to call normal, is just one possible configuration of consciousness, one way of organizing the flux of experience. And it's a configuration that serves certain purposes: social coordination, practical functioning, the maintenance of existing power structures, but not necessarily the purposes of human flourishing, spiritual development, or the evolution of consciousness. McKenna's vision was of a culture that consciously and deliberately expands its reality tunnel rather than narrowing it, that actively seeks out the strange and the novel rather than defending against it. He imagined a civilization that understood itself as a work in progress, an experiment in consciousness, rather than the culmination of history or the final form of human organization. He saw the current cultural moment, with all its chaos and crisis, as potentially the birth pangs of something genuinely new, not just a rearrangement of familiar patterns, but an actual emergence of novel forms of collective intelligence. But for this to happen, enough individuals need to break free from the mimetic programming that keeps consciousness locked in repetitive patterns. They need to recognize that their thoughts are not their own, that they've been carrying water for systems that don't serve them, repeating narratives that diminish rather than expand their possibilities. They need to develop what McKenna called intellectual courage, the willingness to question everything, to follow the argument wherever it leads, to entertain ideas that might threaten their current understanding of themselves and reality. This is not easy. The ego will fight to maintain its illusion of sovereignty, its sense that it's in control, that it knows what's going on. The culture will punish deviation from consensus reality with marginalization, ridicule, or pathologization. Your family and friends may worry about you if you start questioning the fundamental assumptions that hold their world together. The mimetic immune system of culture is designed to attack and neutralize ideas that threaten the existing order, and the people who carry those ideas often face social consequences. But here's what McKenna understood. The cost of not breaking free is even higher. The cost is living your entire life as a vector for someone else's agenda, as a host for parasitic thought forms that drain your vitality while giving you nothing in return. The cost is never knowing who you might have been if you'd had the courage to think your own thoughts, to pursue your own vision, to become more than the sum of your cultural programming. The cost is participating in the reproduction of a system that's driving civilization toward ecological catastrophe, social breakdown, and spiritual emptiness. The mimetic environment of industrial culture is toxic, and it's making people sick in ways that go beyond the physical. The epidemic of depression, anxiety, addiction, and meaninglessness that characterizes modern life is not primarily a medical problem or a psychological problem. It's a cultural problem. It's what happens when you try to run human consciousness on an operating system designed for something else, when you program people with thoughts that make them productive workers and avid consumers, but leave them feeling empty, disconnected, and lost. The thoughts that dominate mainstream culture are thoughts of scarcity, competition, separation. They tell you that you're fundamentally alone, that you're in competition with everyone else for limited resources, that your worth is measured by your productivity and your possessions, that nature is dead matter to be exploited, that consciousness is an accidental byproduct of material processes, that there's no meaning except what you can extract through will and effort. These thoughts create a particular kind of reality, a particular experience of being alive, and it's an experience that most people find, at some deep level, unsatisfying. McKenna was offering a different set of memes, thoughts that arise from a different understanding of what consciousness is and what it's for. Thoughts of abundance rather than scarcity, of cooperation rather than competition, of interconnection rather than separation. Thoughts that recognize consciousness as primary rather than derivative, that see the universe as alive and intelligent, that understand human beings as participants in a vast evolutionary process that's going somewhere interesting. Thoughts that open up possibilities rather than closing them down, that expand your sense of what's real rather than contracting it. These are not just positive thoughts or optimistic beliefs that you adopt to make yourself feel better. They're different organizing principles for consciousness itself, different ways of passing experience that create different realities, different lived experiences of what it means to be human. And the crucial thing to understand is that they're just as valid, just as rooted in actual experience, as the more pessimistic and reductive thought forms that dominate mainstream culture. They're not escapism or wishful thinking. They're alternative interpretations of the same fundamental mystery of existence. What determines which thought forms you adopt is not their objective truth value, because at this level, all worldviews are interpretive frameworks rather than simple descriptions of how things are, but rather their consequences, their effects on your experience and behavior. The question to ask about any meme is not, is it true, but rather, what does it do? What kind of consciousness does it create? What possibilities does it open or close? What kind of person do you become if you take this thought seriously and let it shape your perception and action? From this perspective, the choice of which thoughts to host, which memes to replicate, becomes an ethical and aesthetic choice. You're not trying to discover some pre-existing truth about reality. You're participating in the creation of reality through your attention and your action. You're choosing what kind of world to bring into being through the quality of consciousness you cultivate and express. You're voting, with every thought you entertain and every action you take, for the kind of future you want to inhabit. McKenna believed that consciousness itself is the most powerful force in the universe, that it's not a passive observer of a material world, but an active participant in the world's becoming. This is not solipsism. It's not the claim that you individually create your reality through positive thinking, or that the material world doesn't exist independently of your perception. It's the recognition that consciousness and matter are not separate substances, but different aspects of a single process, that the observer and the observed are entangled in ways that make their absolute separation impossible, that the act of observation participates in what's observed. This view, which sounds mystical, is actually increasingly supported by developments in quantum physics, complexity theory, and the cognitive sciences. The old mechanistic worldview, which saw the universe as a giant clockwork machine running on deterministic laws, has been replaced by a more organic vision of reality as a self-organizing, evolving, fundamentally creative process in which consciousness plays a generative role. You are not a separate ego observing an external world. You are a process of the universe becoming aware of itself, a local intensification of the cosmic creative principle. When you understand this, the question of whose thoughts you host takes on cosmic significance. You're not just choosing memes that affect your personal experience. You're participating in the larger evolution of consciousness itself, helping to determine which patterns will propagate into the future. Every time you entertain a thought, give it your attention, speak it aloud, or act on it, you're voting for that pattern, strengthening it in the collective field, making it more likely to arise in other minds. You are literally shaping the future of consciousness through your participation in the present mimetic environment. This is both an enormous responsibility and an extraordinary opportunity. It means your life matters in ways you probably didn't realize, that the quality of your consciousness has effects that ripple out far beyond your individual experience. It means that the work of becoming conscious, of examining your inherited patterns, of deliberately curating your mimetic environment, is not just personal development. It's evolutionary activism, participation in the larger project of conscious evolution. McKenna was convinced that we're living in a particularly crucial moment in this evolutionary process, a time when the old order is collapsing and something genuinely new might emerge. He saw the acceleration of novelty, the increasing pace of cultural and technological change, the breakdown of traditional structures, as signs that we're approaching what he called the transcendental object at the end of time, a point of maximum complexity and consciousness toward which history has been moving. Whether you take this literally or metaphorically, it points to something real, the sense that we're living through a phase transition, a fundamental reorganization of human civilization and consciousness. In such moments, the mimetic environment becomes especially fluid. The thoughts that structured the old order lose their power, and there's a brief window of opportunity before new structures crystallize and harden. This is when individual consciousness matters most, when the choices you make about which thoughts to host and which to reject can actually influence the direction of the larger cultural evolution. This is when you can't afford to remain passive, can't afford to simply repeat the programs you were given, can't afford to let others do your thinking for you. The challenge is that this fluidity is also disorienting, even terrifying. When the old certainties collapse, when the shared narratives that held reality together start to dissolve, people naturally reach for new certainties, new narratives that promise to make sense of the chaos. This is why times of cultural crisis often see the rise of authoritarian movements, fundamentalist ideologies, conspiracy theories. They offer simple answers to complex questions, clear identities in a moment of confusion, the comfort of belonging to a group that knows the truth while everyone else is lost in darkness. These rigid thought forms are seductive precisely because they offer what psychologists call cognitive closure, the feeling of having arrived at final answers, of no longer needing to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. They promise to relieve the anxiety of not knowing, the burden of having to figure things out for yourself, the responsibility of navigating complexity without a map. But they do this by dramatically narrowing consciousness, by filtering out anything that doesn't fit the predetermined narrative, by turning the rich multidimensional reality into a simple good versus evil story. McKenna's path was the opposite: to increase your tolerance for ambiguity, to develop the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without needing them to resolve into a single truth, to surf the chaos rather than trying to freeze it into premature order. This requires a different kind of strength, a different kind of courage. It's easier to grab hold of a rigid belief system than to remain fluid, easier to join a tribe than to think independently, easier to repeat inherited patterns than to venture into genuinely new territory. But the reward for this difficulty is freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to become who you actually are beneath the layers of programming. The freedom to experience reality more directly, without so many filters and interpretations. The freedom to participate consciously in the evolution of consciousness, rather than being unconsciously carried along by forces you don't understand. The freedom to contribute something genuinely new to the collective intelligence of the species, rather than just recycling the past. This freedom begins with the recognition that your thoughts are not your own, that you are not the fixed identity your thoughts construct, that consciousness is much vaster and stranger than any conceptual framework can capture. It continues with the work of observing your thoughts without identifying with them, of noticing when you're running inherited programs, of creating space between the arising of a thought and your response to it. And it culminates in the capacity to consciously choose which thought forms to host, which patterns to replicate, which frequencies to tune into. This choosing is not arbitrary. You're not just making it up as you go along. You're learning to discriminate between thoughts that come from fear and thoughts that come from love, between thoughts that contract your being and thoughts that expand it, between thoughts that serve life and thoughts that serve death. You're developing what could be called spiritual discernment, the ability to sense which ideas are nourishing and which are toxic, which patterns lead toward greater consciousness and which lead toward unconsciousness and entropy. McKenna believed that the psychedelic experience was particularly valuable for developing this discernment because it shows you, unmistakably, that different states of consciousness are possible, that the thoughts running through your mind in ordinary awareness are not the only thoughts available, that there are forms of intelligence and dimensions of meaning that culture has either forgotten or actively suppressed. Once you've experienced this directly, not just as an intellectual idea, but as lived reality, it becomes much harder to take cultural programming at face value, much easier to question the thoughts you've been taught to think. But you don't need psychedelics to begin this process. Any practice that creates gaps in the usual stream of thinking can start to reveal the mimetic nature of thought. Meditation does this by showing you the repetitive, habitual quality of ordinary thinking, the way the same thoughts loop endlessly unless you interrupt them. Art does this by presenting reality in unfamiliar ways that force you to see what you've been trained to overlook. Travel does this by immersing you in different cultural systems, showing you that the ways of thinking you assumed were natural and universal are actually local and contingent. Deep conversation with people from different backgrounds does this by revealing alternative interpretations of reality that are just as coherent as your own. The key is to actively seek out experiences that challenge your current thought forms, that introduce novelty into your mimetic environment, that prevent you from settling into comfortable certainty. This is the opposite of the filter bubble effect, where algorithms and social sorting mechanisms ensure that you only encounter ideas that confirm your existing beliefs. The filter bubble is mimetic stagnation, the mind feeding on itself, thoughts replicating without mutation or evolution. What you need instead is mimetic diversity, exposure to genuinely different ways of thinking, contact with the other in all its forms. This contact with otherness is not just intellectually stimulating, it's existentially necessary for the evolution of consciousness. Without novelty, without the challenge of encountering what doesn't fit your current categories, thought becomes increasingly rigid and brittle. The mimetic environment becomes a closed system, endlessly recycling the same patterns, unable to adapt to changing conditions. Eventually, this rigidity leads to crisis, to the breakdown of the system under the pressure of realities it can't accommodate. This is what's happening now in many aspects of contemporary culture. The old thought forms are breaking down because they can no longer process the complexity of our actual situation. The question then becomes, what's next? What new thought forms are emerging to replace the old ones? What's the next evolution of consciousness? McKenna believed we're in the process of discovering this, that the answer isn't predetermined, but is being created through our collective participation in the present moment. He saw the potential for a radical transformation of human consciousness, a shift from ego-based, separate self-awareness to something more fluid, more interconnected, more capable of handling complexity and paradox. This transformation doesn't mean the end of individuality or the dissolution of the self into some oceanic oneness. It means a more mature understanding of what the self is, not a fixed entity with rigid boundaries, but a process, a dynamic pattern that arises in relationship, a node in a network rather than an isolated atom. It means recognizing that your thoughts are not your private property, but part of a larger conversation, that your consciousness is not contained in your skull, but extends into your relationships, your environment, your culture, the larger living system of which you're a part. When you start to experience yourself this way, the question of whose thoughts you're thinking becomes less about defending some pure, authentic self against foreign invasion, and more about participating skillfully in the larger dance of meaning-making. You're not trying to achieve some impossible purity of thought, some state where every idea originates spontaneously from your own depths. You're recognizing that thought is always a collective phenomenon, that language is always shared, that meaning emerges in the space between minds rather than within any individual mind. But this recognition doesn't lead to passivity or to the abandonment of individual agency. It leads to a more sophisticated form of agency, one that works with the grain of reality rather than against it. Instead of trying to control your thoughts through will and effort, you learn to shape the conditions that give rise to thoughts. Instead of defending beliefs through argument and debate, you create environments where better ideas can emerge. Instead of identifying with any particular thought form, you become a gardener of consciousness, cultivating the conditions for growth while remaining open to surprise. This is what McKenna meant by conscious evolution, not a forced development according to some predetermined plan, but the creation of conditions that allow novelty to emerge, that encourage experimentation and play, that reward flexibility over rigidity. It's evolution that knows it's evolving, that participates consciously in its own becoming. And it starts with individuals who have recognized the mimetic nature of thought and chosen to engage with it creatively rather than being unconsciously determined by it. The path forward involves both a clearing away and a cultivation. You need to clear away the inherited thought forms that no longer serve, the beliefs and assumptions and habitual patterns that keep consciousness stuck in repetitive loops. This is the deconstructive phase, the seeing through, the recognition of how thoroughly you've been programmed. It can be unsettling, even devastating, to realize how little of what you call yourself is actually original, how much is borrowed, inherited, imposed. Many people stop here in a kind of nihilistic paralysis, convinced that there's nothing authentic beneath the layers of programming. But the clearing away is not an end in itself. It creates space for something new to grow. Once you've made some room, once you've loosened the grip of inherited patterns, you can begin to consciously cultivate new thought forms, new ways of organizing experience, new patterns of meaning that are more adequate to the reality you're actually living in. This is the creative phase, the building up, the active participation in the evolution of consciousness. You're no longer just being thought through, you're becoming a co-creator of the thoughts that will structure future human experience. This doesn't mean you suddenly start having completely original thoughts that no one has ever thought before. It means you become more aware of which thoughts you're hosting, more deliberate about which patterns you replicate, more creative in how you combine and recombine existing memes into new configurations. You become, in effect, a more conscious participant in the larger evolutionary process, a more skilled player in the game of meaning-making that human culture has always been playing. McKenna's great gift was to articulate this process in language that made it accessible, that turned abstract philosophical insights into lived reality, that infected people with memes about memes that helped them see the nature of thought itself. He was a mimetic engineer, designing thought forms specifically intended to wake people up from their programmed sleep, to help them recognize the constructed nature of consensus reality, to inspire them to take responsibility for their own consciousness rather than outsourcing it to culture, media, authority figures, or tradition. The ultimate insight, the meta-meme that contains all the others, is this. Consciousness is not a thing, but a process, not a possession, but a participation, not a noun, but a verb. You are not a static entity having thoughts, but a dynamic event, an ongoing activity of consciousness, knowing itself through form. The thoughts that arise in your awareness are temporary crystallizations of this process, waves on the ocean of consciousness that appear for a moment and then dissolve back into the deeper water from which they came. When you understand this experientially, not just intellectually, everything changes. You stop defending your thoughts as if they were precious possessions. You stop being threatened by ideas that challenge your worldview. You stop trying to force reality into comfortable categories. You become more fluid, more playful, more willing to experiment with different ways of thinking and being. You recognize that you are not your thoughts any more than the sky is the clouds that pass through it, that the awareness reading these words is more fundamental than any content it could contain. This awareness, this consciousness that witnesses thoughts without being reducible to them, is what McKenna was ultimately pointing toward. Not as some mystical abstraction or spiritual ideal, but as the most basic fact of your existence, the ground from which everything else arises. When you rest in this awareness, even briefly, you taste the freedom that's always been available, the freedom that exists prior to and independent of any thought, belief, or identity. Your thoughts are not your own, but you are not your thoughts. You are the space in which thoughts appear, the consciousness that knows them, the awareness that remains when every thought has fallen away. This awareness cannot be captured by any meme, infected by any virus, programmed by any culture. It is what you actually are, beneath all the layers of conditioning, beyond all the inherited patterns, prior to all the stories you've been told about who you should be. McKenna's message, stripped to its essence, was an invitation to recognize this and to live from it, to participate in the dance of thought and culture and meaning-making, while knowing that you are not reducible to any of it, that your true nature is vaster and freer than any thought could express. The thoughts flowing through your mind right now, as you read these words, are part of an ancient conversation, a dialogue that stretches back to the origins of language and forward to the unknown future of consciousness. You are not their source, but you are their witness, their temporary home, their partner in the ongoing creation of meaning. And in this recognition lies the possibility of transformation, both personal and collective, both individual and evolutionary. When enough people understand the mimetic nature of thought, when enough consciousness awakens to its own process, when enough individuals take responsibility for curating their mental environment, rather than passively absorbing culture's default programming, something genuinely new becomes possible. Not a predetermined outcome, not some utopian fantasy, but a real opening, a genuine evolutionary leap, a transformation of human consciousness that we can barely imagine from our current vantage point. This is not guaranteed. The future is not written. The evolution of consciousness depends on choices being made right now, by individuals who have the courage to question their inherited thoughts, who have the wisdom to discriminate between life-serving and death-serving memes, who have the creativity to envision and enact new possibilities. It depends on you recognizing that the thoughts running through your mind at this very moment are not your private property, but part of a vast collective intelligence, and that you have a choice, not about whether to participate in this collective process, but about how consciously and skillfully you participate. McKenna knew he couldn't give you the answers, couldn't program you with the right thoughts to replace the wrong ones. All he could do was infect you with questions, with a capacity for wonder, with a recognition of the profound strangeness of existence, with an appetite for novelty and a courage to face the unknown. All he could do was point you back to your own experience, to the irreducible mystery of consciousness itself, to the awareness that is reading these words and recognizing itself in them. Your thoughts are not your own, but the awareness of this fact, the capacity to recognize thought as thought, the space in which recognition occurs, that is yours in a deeper sense, because it is what you most fundamentally are. And from this recognition, from this ground of aware presence, anything becomes possible. Not because you can control the thoughts that arise, but because you are no longer controlled by them. Not because you transcend the mimetic environment, but because you can navigate it more consciously, more creatively, more freely. This is the transmission McKenna offered, the virus he released into the culture, the thought pattern he hoped would replicate and evolve and ultimately transform human consciousness itself. Whether it succeeds depends on whether it finds fertile ground in minds like yours, whether it takes root and grows and produces new mutations, whether it participates in the larger shift toward a more awakened collective intelligence. The answer to that question is being written right now, in the quality of attention you bring to this moment, in the choices you make about which thoughts to host and which to release, in your willingness to participate consciously in the ongoing evolution of mind.